The blood pooling beneath Eton's ribs was warm against the cold Damascus stone, and the radio in his left hand crackled with static that sounded like breathing. He pressed his back against the alley wall, felt the bullet lodged somewhere between his spine and lung shift with each shallow breath, and watched the red dot of a laser sight sweep the darkness 3 meters from his boots. His right hand held the detonator. His team was still inside the compound. The extraction window closed in 4 minutes. Someone on the other end of the radio was calling his name, but Eton didn't answer, because answering meant admitting he couldn't stand. And if he couldn't stand, they would abort. And if they aborted, 18 months of placement, 2 dead assets, and the location of the Iranian nuclear engineer would vanish into the Syrian night like smoke. The voice on the radio belonged to Rafi, his second in command, 28 years old with a wife in Haifa, who thought her husband installed security systems for banks. Rafi had joined the unit 3 years ago, young and eager, and convinced that courage was louder than calculation. Eton had spent those 3 years teaching him that the opposite was true, that the best operators were the ones who could sit in a room for 6 hours without moving, who could walk past their target without a glance, who could make the impossible look routine. Rafi had learned. He'd become one of the best. And now his voice crackled through the static, professional and tight. Eton, status, we have the package. Repeat, we have the package. 30 seconds to rally point. The package, not the engineer, because using names on an open channel was suicide, even an encrypted one. Not the laptop, because being specific gave away too much. Just the package. 2 syllables that meant 18 months of work, 6 dead drops, 4 compromised assets, and 1,000 decisions that had led to this moment in a Damascus alley with blood pooling beneath Eton's ribs. Eton's thumb hovered over the transmit button. The package meant they had the engineer's laptop, the files, maybe the man himself if the timing held. 30 seconds meant they were moving through the courtyard now, past the fountain where 2 Syrian guards lay unconscious from the gas Leora had deployed through the ventilation system. Leora, their technical specialist, 26 years old, born in Hadera to parents who'd survived the Second Intifada. She could crack a safe in 90 seconds and build a listening device from a calculator and a phone charger. She'd spent 2 weeks mapping the compound's security system, memorizing guard rotations, finding the blind spots in the camera coverage. Tonight, she'd disabled the alarms and deployed the gas with the precision of a surgeon, giving the team exactly 7 minutes to reach the engineer's office on the 3rd floor. 7 minutes. They'd practiced it 40 times in a warehouse outside Herzliya, a full-scale mock-up of the Damascus compound built from satellite images and intelligence reports. 7 minutes to climb the stairs, bypass the door lock, access the safe, copy the hard drive, and retreat. They'd done it in 6 minutes and 30 seconds on their best run. Tonight, with adrenaline and stakes that couldn't be measured, they'd probably done it in 5. The rally point was the service entrance, the one Eton was supposed to be covering, the one he'd been covering until the patrol came around the corner and someone's radio had chirped and the first bullet caught him in the side before he could bring his weapon up. He'd been watching the courtyard through night vision, tracking Rafi's team as they moved through the building like ghosts. 3 floors up, 3rd window from the left. He'd seen the lights flicker when Leora cut the power. He'd seen the shadows cross the window when they entered the office. He'd started counting down from 7 minutes and reached 4 when he'd heard the footsteps behind him. He'd killed both guards. The suppressed shots had sounded like books falling in a library. Then he'd stumbled into the alley and understood that the warm sensation spreading across his abdomen wasn't sweat. 2 guards, young men, maybe 20 years old, probably conscripts doing their mandatory service. They'd been talking about football when they'd rounded the corner. Eton had heard them before he'd seen them, their voices carrying in the quiet Damascus night. He'd had 3 seconds to decide, take the shot or try to hide. 3 seconds to calculate angles, escape routes, sound discipline. 3 seconds that felt like hours. He'd chosen the shot. Clean, professional. 2 in the chest for the first guard, 1 in the head for the second when the man had reached for his radio. The suppressed pistol had coughed twice, 3 times, and both guards had dropped without a sound. Eton had caught the second one before he fell, lowered him gently to the ground, reached for the radio to destroy it. That's when he'd felt the burning in his side. The first guard hadn't been dead. Wounded, bleeding, but not dead. And in those final seconds of consciousness, he'd managed to draw his sidearm and fire once, blindly, at the shadow that had killed his partner. The bullet had caught Eton just below the ribs, punched through his tactical vest at an angle that avoided the ceramic plate, and buried itself somewhere in his abdomen. Eton had put another round in the guard's head. Then he'd pressed his hand to the wound and felt the blood pulsing between his fingers, and known with absolute certainty that he wasn't walking out of Damascus tonight. Eitan, respond. The laser sight disappeared. Footsteps echoed from the main street. Eitan counted them. 4 sets. Boots, not shoes. Military. The Syrian army had a checkpoint 2 blocks north. Someone had heard something, where the bodies had been found, where the shift change had come early.
Eitan checked his watch. 3 minutes. He pressed transmit. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. Rally point compromised. Secondary exit. The cafe on Al-Hamra. Go now. What's your position? Already there. Move. Silence. Then Rafis's voice, sharper. Eitan. That's an order. Eitan released the button and turned off his radio. The footsteps were closer now. He could hear voices, Arabic, talking about the curfew and a woman one of them had met at a checkpoint. Normal conversation. They hadn't found the bodies yet, but they would. And when they did, they would lock down 6 blocks in every direction, and his team would be caught in a net they couldn't cut through. Unless someone gave them time. The detonator in his hand was connected to 3 charges placed along the compound's eastern wall, the opposite direction from where his team was moving. The explosion would pull every soldier in the district toward the noise. It would also announce that something had happened here, that someone had been here, that the operation everyone pretended hadn't occurred had in fact occurred. Tel Aviv would deny everything. Damascus would scream about sovereignty. The cables would light up. And Eitan's name would be buried so deep in classified files that even his mother wouldn't be told how he died. He thought about his mother. She lived in Jerusalem, in the apartment where he'd grown up, where his father's photograph still sat on the mantel next to a memorial candle that burned every year on the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. His father had been a tank commander in the Sinai. He hadn't come home. Eitan had been 3 years old. He didn't remember his father's voice, only the way his mother's hands shook when she lit the candle. He'd asked her once, when he was 15 and angry about a father he'd never known, why she kept lighting that candle.
Why she kept the photograph on the mantel. Why she couldn't just move on. She'd looked at him with eyes that had seen too much grief and said, because he chose us. He chose the country, the people, the future. And someone has to remember that choice, or it means nothing. Eitan had joined the army at 18, officer's course at 20, unit selection at 22. He'd never told his mother what he really did, where he really went when he called from foreign cities and said he was on training exercises. She'd never asked. Some silences ran in families, passed down like heirlooms too heavy to discuss. The footsteps stopped at the mouth of the alley. Eitan looked down at the blood on his hands and thought about the engineer, Khalil Nazari, 52 years old, graduate of Moscow State University, specialist in gas centrifuge technology, the man who had solved the problem of uranium enrichment at speeds the Iranians had only dreamed about. The man whose work would put a nuclear weapon in Tehran's hands within 18 months if someone didn't stop him. The man who had come to Damascus to meet with Hezbollah about transferring the technology. The man whose laptop contained every formula, every schematic, every calculation needed to turn theory into fire. The man Eitan's team had just stolen. They'd been tracking Nazari for 2 years, first in Tehran, where he taught at the university and published papers on theoretical physics that hid weapon designs in academic language. Then in Natanz, where he disappeared into the underground facility and emerged 6 months later having solved the problem that had plagued Iran's nuclear program for a decade: how to enrich uranium fast enough to build a bomb before the world noticed.
The intelligence had come from a source inside the Iranian program, a junior scientist who'd grown disillusioned with the revolution and contacted Israeli intelligence through a dead drop in Istanbul. The scientist had provided documents, photographs, technical specifications. He'd provided Nazari's schedule, his security detail, his travel patterns. And then, 3 weeks before the Damascus meeting, the scientist had been found in his apartment with a bullet in his head and a suicide note that fooled no one. The Iranians had known someone was leaking, they just hadn't known how much. Nazari's trip to Damascus had been hastily arranged, sold as an academic conference, but actually a meeting to discuss transferring centrifuge technology to Hezbollah. The intelligence suggested Hezbollah wanted to build their own enrichment facility in Lebanon, hidden in the Bekaa Valley, funded by Iranian money and protected by Syrian security.
If that facility became operational, the entire regional balance would collapse. Israel would face not just one nuclear threat, but two. The calculations became simple after that. Stop Nazari in Damascus or fight a war no one could win. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Etan pressed himself against the wall, felt the rough stone scrape against the entry wound, tasted copper in his mouth. The beam swept left, right, caught the edge of his boot, stopped. There. Etan pressed the detonator. The explosion lit the Damascus sky like a second sun. The shockwave rattled windows 3 streets away and set off car alarms in a symphony of panic. The eastern wall of the compound collapsed inward, taking half the second floor with it, and the orange fireball that rolled into the night sky could be seen from the presidential palace. Debris rained down on the courtyard, concrete chunks, steel rebar, shattered glass that glittered like stars falling to earth.
The sound was apocalyptic, a roar that echoed off the surrounding buildings and sent flocks of birds scattering into the darkness. The 4 soldiers at the mouth of the alley turned and ran toward the sound, shouting into their radios, and Etan closed his eyes and listened to their footsteps fade into the chaos. He counted to 60, letting the chaos build, letting the confusion spread like wildfire through the Syrian response network. Emergency services would be converging now, fire trucks and ambulances and police vehicles all trying to navigate the narrow Damascus streets. Command posts would be lighting up with contradictory reports. Officers would be demanding answers no one had. The city would spiral into controlled panic, and in that panic, his team would disappear like smoke. Then he opened his eyes and tried to stand. His legs didn't respond. The blood beneath him had spread into a pool the size of a dinner plate, dark and thick in the moonlight. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, too fast, too shallow, each pulse sending fresh agony through his torso. Shock, probably. Blood loss, definitely. Internal bleeding, certainly. He'd been shot before, twice, once in Lebanon and once in Cairo, but those had been clean wounds, through and throughs that hurt like fire but didn't touch anything vital. This was different. This was the kind of wound you didn't walk away from unless someone carried you. And no one was coming to carry him. He pulled out his phone. It was a cheap Nokia, the kind you could buy in any Damascus market, programmed with one number that would connect to a relay in Ankara that would bounce the signal to a desk in Tel Aviv, where someone would answer in Turkish and take a message. He'd never used it.
Using it meant the operation had failed so completely that normal protocols were broken, that the careful layers of separation between field operations and command had collapsed, that something had gone so catastrophically wrong that direct contact was the only option left. He dialed. The connection took 8 seconds, each one feeling like an hour. A woman's voice answered in Turkish. Yes? Etan spoke in Arabic, the code phrase they'd memorized in training, the words that would trigger immediate escalation to the operations desk. The shipment has been delayed. A pause. He could hear computer keys clicking in the background, someone pulling up his file, confirming his identity through voice recognition software. Then Hebrew, low and urgent. What's your situation? Etan recognized the voice now. Miriam, operations coordinator. 42 years old, 15 years with the agency. Legendary for her ability to manage 3 operations simultaneously while appearing calm enough to order lunch. Rafi has the package. Clean exit on Alhambra. Confirm extraction. Confirmed. Van is en route to the border. ETA 45 minutes. A pause. And you? Delayed. Another pause. Longer. He could almost see her leaning forward at her desk, eyes narrowing, analyzing the silence between his words. How delayed? Etan looked down at the blood. It had stopped spreading, which meant his blood pressure was dropping, which meant his body was shutting down. Permanently. The silence stretched. Then Miriam's voice changed, shifted from professional to personal, from coordinator to human being. Etan, listen to me very carefully. We have a team in Damascus. Medical. Trauma surgeon, 2 paramedics, full field hospital setup. They can be at your location in 15 minutes. The city's about to be locked down. Every checkpoint will be active. Every street will have patrols. Then we move fast. They have diplomatic plates, UN credentials, the whole package. Give me your location and I'll vector them in. Rafi and the others are already 30 kilometers from Damascus and accelerating. The van hit the highway 4 minutes ago. They're clean. They're safe. They're going home. Her voice softened. Now give me your location. Eton closed his eyes. 15 minutes. Even if the medical team could navigate the chaos, even if they could reach him before the Syrians locked down the district, even if they could extract him without triggering an international incident, what then? A race to the border with a dying man in the back of a van? A diplomatic crisis when the Syrians discovered an Israeli operative being smuggled out of their capital? The mission compromised, the networks exposed, the years of careful work unraveled because one man couldn't accept the price. He thought about the engineer's laptop, probably being transferred to the diplomatic pouch right now, probably already on its way to a UN convoy that would cross into Jordan before sunrise. He thought about the data on that laptop, the formulas that would be analyzed, the networks that would be mapped, the operations that would be launched to dismantle Iran's nuclear program piece by careful piece. He thought about the lives that would be saved, the war that would be prevented, the future that would continue because tonight, in Damascus, someone had made a choice. One life weighed against the mission. That was the calculation they'd all signed up for. That was the oath he'd taken in a windowless room in Tel Aviv when he was 22 years old and stupid enough to believe immortality came with the badge.
They'd shown him videos of failed operations, missions where one hesitation had cost everything, where one operator's refusal to accept casualties had turned victory into catastrophe. They'd shown him the mathematics of sacrifice, the cold equations where individual lives became variables in larger calculations. And then they'd asked him, can you make that choice? Can you order someone to their death? Can you accept your own death? Can you look at the mission and your life and choose the mission every single time? He'd said yes. They all said yes. It was easy to say yes in a training room where death was theoretical and heroism was aspirational. It was harder to say yes in a Damascus alley with your blood pooling on ancient stone and your team's lives hanging on your voice. But Eton had meant it then, and he meant it now. Eton, location, now. Miriam's voice was sharp, command wrapped in concern. He thought about his mother's hands lighting that candle. He thought about Rafi's wife in Haifa, how she'd smile when her husband came home and never know how close she'd come to widow's black. He thought about the engineer's laptop, the secrets locked inside it, the weapon that wouldn't be built because tonight, in a Damascus alley, someone had bled to buy time. Negative, Eton said. His voice was steady, which surprised him. Abort rescue. Confirm Rafi's extraction only. That's not your call. I'm the field commander. It's exactly my call. He paused, felt blood fill his mouth, swallowed it down. 15 minutes puts your medical team in the heart of the response zone. You'll lose them and me. The mission is successful. Keep it that way. God damn it, Eton. Tell my mother it was quick. Tell her I didn't suffer. Tell her whatever story helps her sleep. He coughed, tasted more blood. And Miriam? Tell her I chose. Make sure she knows I chose.
Eton. He hung up. Then he took the battery out of the phone and threw both pieces into the darkness. The explosion was still echoing across the city. Sirens were converging from every direction. He could hear helicopters now, the deep thrum of rotors cutting through the smoke-filled air. The Syrians would search every building, every alley, every shadow until they found whoever had done this. They wouldn't find anyone. Eton pulled a small plastic capsule from the lining of his jacket. Standard issue. Everyone carried one. No one talked about it. He held it up to the faint light bleeding from the street and saw the liquid inside, clear as water, final as gravity. They told him in training it would take 30 seconds. No pain, just sleep, and then nothing. He thought about using it. Then he put it back in his pocket, because there was still work to do. The blood trail from the alley to the street would tell a story. The Syrian investigators would follow it, photograph it, analyze it. They would find his DNA, and even if they didn't know his name, they would know someone had been here, had been wounded, had escaped, or died somewhere in the labyrinth of Damascus. That story would lead to questions. Questions would lead to pressure. Pressure would lead to leaks, and leaks could compromise the networks, the assets, the ghosts who made missions like this possible. Unless the story ended differently. Eton pulled himself forward, using his arms, dragging his useless legs behind him. Each movement sent lightning through his spine. He bit down on his sleeve to keep from screaming and pulled himself another meter. The street was 15 meters away. He could see the glow of headlights, hear voices shouting in Arabic. The fire was spreading. Someone was calling for ambulances.
He reached the first body.
The Syrian guard he'd shot, young, maybe 20, with a wedding ring on his left hand. Etan searched the man's pockets and found a phone, a wallet with a few Syrian pounds, a photograph of a woman holding a baby. He took the phone and left the rest. The second guard was older, gray in his beard, sergeant stripes on his shoulder. Etan took his radio. Then he pulled himself to the corner of the building and looked out at the street. Chaos. Soldiers running toward the explosion, civilians running away from it, a fire truck trying to navigate the narrow street while cars blocked the way and drivers shouted at each other. No one was looking at the alley. No one was looking at the ground. They were all looking at the sky, at the black smoke rising like a pillar of judgment. Etan turned on the radio. It crackled with traffic, a dozen voices speaking over each other in the controlled panic of an emergency response. Emergency channels, command posts, officers trying to coordinate a response to an attack they didn't understand. Fire crews reporting the blaze was spreading to adjacent buildings, police sealing off the district, military units demanding to know if this was terrorism, sabotage, and Israeli strike. A colonel's voice cut through the chaos, demanding order, demanding answers, demanding someone tell him what the hell had just happened in the middle of Damascus. Etan listened until he found the right frequency, the one where a colonel was demanding to know if anyone had eyes on suspects, if anyone had found evidence, if anyone knew what the hell had just happened. The colonel's voice was raw with frustration and fear, the kind of fear that came from knowing heads would roll for this, that someone would be blamed, that the presidential palace would demand accountability, and someone would have to provide it. Etan pressed transmit.
His Arabic was flawless. Damascus accent, the kind learned from years of immersion, from countless hours in safe houses with native speakers drilling pronunciation and idiom. This is Sergeant Hamid, Eastern Checkpoint. We have movement in the University District, possible suspects fleeing north on foot. Silence. Etan could almost hear the colonel's mind working, seizing on this first concrete lead, this first piece of actionable intelligence in the chaos. Then the colonel's voice, sharp and grateful. How many? At least 3, male, dark clothing. They ran when the explosion hit, headed toward the old souk. Description. Etan thought fast. Average height. One appeared to be carrying something. Couldn't see faces in the smoke. He coughed, let it sound like distress from the smoke and fire. We're moving to intercept but need backup. Hold position. Units are responding. Do not engage alone. Repeat, do not engage. Copy, Etan said, then added the detail that would sell it. Sir, requesting permission to seal the northern checkpoints, if they're heading for Lebanon. Already done. Every exit is locked down. Nothing moves until we have these bastards. Understood. Etan turned off the radio and threw it into the alley. The University District was 4 kilometers north, the opposite direction from where his team was heading. By the time the Syrians realized the report was false, realized no Sergeant Hamid existed at the eastern checkpoint, realized they'd been chasing ghosts while the real operator slipped through their fingers, Rafi would be across the border. The van would be in Jordan, the package would be secure, and the mission would be written up as a success in the files that would never be declassified. And the search would focus on the wrong direction, the wrong profile, the wrong story.
Syrian intelligence would spend weeks chasing leads that didn't exist, interrogating students who knew nothing, building a narrative around university activists or terrorist cells that would take them further and further from the truth. The real story, Israeli operators, nuclear intelligence, targeted raid, would remain buried beneath layers of misdirection. Etan had just bought his team more than time. He'd bought them invisibility. He closed his eyes and let his head rest against the stone. The cold was complete now, not just in his legs, but in his arms, his chest, his thoughts. He could feel his heartbeat slowing, each thrum weaker than the last, like a clock winding down in an empty room. The pain had faded to something distant, abstract, as if it belonged to someone else's body. He thought about the mission, about every step that had led to this moment. The intelligence briefing 6 months ago when they'd first learned about Nazari.
The planning sessions that had stretched into early morning, mapping exits and timing windows and contingencies for every possible failure. The trading runs where they'd practiced until every movement was muscle memory. The insertion into Syria through the Kurdish territories, the false identities that had held through 2 checkpoints, the safe house in Damascus where they'd finalized the plan. He thought about his team. Rafi, who'd grown from an eager recruit into a seasoned operative. Leora, whose technical genius had turned impossible missions into merely difficult ones. Dav, their driver, who could navigate Damascus blindfolded. Yael, their intelligence analyst, who'd spent months building the network that had made this operation possible. Each of them had skills he didn't have, perspectives he needed, strengths that compensated for his weaknesses.
That was the secret of good command. Knowing you weren't the smartest person in the room, weren't the fastest or the strongest, but you were the one who could see how all the pieces fit together. You were the one who could make the impossible decisions and live with the consequences. Or die with them. That was the trade. Silence for safety. Shadows for survival. A name erased in exchange for a future that continued. Eitan opened his eyes one last time and looked at the Damascus sky. The smoke was thinning. He could see stars now, the same stars that shone over Jerusalem, over Haifa, over the beach where he'd learned to swim as a child. The same stars that had guided his father's tank across the Sinai and watched him die in the sand. He wondered if his mother would light a candle for him. He wondered if they would tell her, if they would call her into some government office and hand her a flag and a story about training accidents and heroism. He wondered if she would believe it, or if she would see through the lies the way she'd probably seen through them when they came to tell her about his father. The irony wasn't lost on him. 2 generations, 2 wars, 2 men who'd left that apartment in Jerusalem and never come home. His mother had buried his father when Eitan was 3, had raised him alone, had watched him grow up and join the army and disappear into the same shadows that had swallowed his father. She'd never said, "Don't go," never tried to stop him, never made him choose between duty and family. But she'd known. On the day he'd told her he'd been accepted into the unit, she'd looked at him with eyes that had already mourned him and said, "Your father used to say that some debts can only be paid with time, and some with blood. Make sure you know which kind you're paying." He thought he'd understood.
He'd thought he was paying with time, with years of service, with missions that would eventually end and let him retire to some quiet life. He hadn't realized until tonight that the debt was always going to be paid in blood, that the moment he'd taken the oath, he'd signed a check that would eventually come due. And now it had. He wondered if it mattered, if the calculations justified the cost, if the engineer's laptop was worth a life, worth his life specifically. The analysts would say yes, the politicians would say yes, history might say yes, though history would never know his name or what he'd done or how much it had cost. But his mother would pay the real price. She would sit in that Jerusalem apartment and light that candle and add another photograph to the mantle, and she would spend the rest of her life wondering if it had been worth it, wondering if the country that took her husband and her son had given her anything in return except grief. Eitan hoped so. He hoped the families his death protected would grow old safely, would never know how close they'd come to fire, would live ordinary lives that felt boring and beautiful. He hoped his mother would see those families, would see the children playing in parks and the couples growing old together, and would understand in some wordless way that this was the trade. Safety for sacrifice, peace for blood, 1,000 ordinary lives bought with one extraordinary death. He hoped, but he would never know. The footsteps were coming back. He could hear them, slow and cautious, sweeping the alley for evidence. They would find him soon. They would find the blood, the bodies, the pieces of the story that didn't fit, and they would try to understand what had happened here, in this alley, on this night. But they wouldn't, because the only person who knew was dying, and the dead keep secrets better than the living. Eitan's last thought was of Rafi. He hoped the younger man made it home. He hoped the wife in Haifa got to grow old with her husband. He hoped the mission was worth it. Then the darkness came, and the stars went out, and the alley fell silent, except for the distant sound of sirens singing their lonely song to the Damascus night.
3 weeks later, Rafi stood in a cemetery north of Tel Aviv and watched them lower an empty coffin into the ground. The morning was cold, the wind carrying salt from the Mediterranean and the scent of eucalyptus from the trees that lined the cemetery. The gravestone would say Eitan Lev, beloved son, died in service to his country. The file would say training accident. The truth would stay buried under classifications that wouldn't be declassified for 50 years, maybe longer, maybe never. There were 20 people at the funeral. Officers in uniform who stood at attention and saluted. Colleagues in civilian clothes who'd worked missions Eitan would never discuss. Miriam from operations wearing dark glasses that hid her eyes. A few others Rafi didn't recognize, probably unit commanders or government officials making appearances. And his mother, standing apart from everyone else, a small woman in black holding a memorial candle that flickered in the wind. The military chaplain had said the prayers. Someone had played Hatikvah on a trumpet, the notes sharp and mournful in the cold air. And then they'd lowered the empty coffin into the earth, while 2 soldiers folded a flag with mechanical precision and handed it to Eitan's mother with words Rafi couldn't hear. She took the flag without expression, without tears, without the breakdown Rafi had expected. She just stood there, holding it like it weighed nothing, like she'd done this before. Like she'd practiced for this moment her entire life. Because she'd buried Eitan's father.
And now she was burying Eitan. The same ceremony, the same prayers, the same empty promises about honor and service and sacrifice. Rafi's hand shook as he placed a stone on the grave, the traditional Jewish gesture of remembrance. The stone was small, smooth, picked from the path leading to the gravesite. It looked insignificant sitting there on the fresh earth, but Rafi knew it would stay. Years from now, when the grass had grown over the grave and the weather had worn the stone smooth, that pebble would still be there, a marker that someone had remembered, someone had mourned, someone had come to pay respects to a man whose story could never be told. The wife in Haifa didn't know why her husband had come home that week with shadows in his eyes and silence on his lips. She didn't know that he woke up at 3 in the morning and stood at the window looking at nothing, his face reflected in the glass like a ghost watching the world. She didn't know that when she asked him what was wrong, he smiled and said he was fine and held her like she might disappear, like he was memorizing the feel of her in his arms. She didn't know that her husband had left a friend bleeding in a Damascus alley, that he'd obeyed an order to abandon a dying man, that he'd climbed into a van and driven away while someone he'd trained with, fought beside, trusted with his life, lay dying alone in a foreign city. She didn't know, and Rafi would never tell her. The code demanded silence. The oath required it. But the weight of that silence was crushing him, breaking something fundamental inside him that he wasn't sure could be repaired. He'd tried to refuse the order. For 3 seconds in that Damascus courtyard, with Eitan's voice crackling through his earpiece telling them to take the secondary exit, Rafi had stopped moving.
He'd looked at Leora, had seen the same question in her eyes. Do we obey? Do we abandon him? Do we leave a man behind? The training said yes. The code said yes. Eitan's orders said yes. But every instinct Rafi had, every value he'd been raised with, every promise soldiers make to each other about never leaving anyone behind, all of that screamed no. Leora had made the choice for him. She'd grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the service entrance, toward the van, toward safety. And Rafi had followed, because that's what operators did. They followed orders even when their hearts rebelled. They trusted the chain of command even when it led them away from their friends. They made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Or tried to. Miriam stood beside Rafi at the funeral. She was wearing black, and her daughter stood next to her, 10 years old, holding her mother's hand. The girl had played violin at the service, a piece by Beethoven that sounded like sorrow made sound. Afterward, she asked her mother why the casket was closed. Miriam said the body had been burned. It was easier than the truth.
The engineer's laptop had yielded everything they'd hoped for and more. Names, facilities, timelines, source code for the centrifuge controllers, communications with Hezbollah, financial records showing how the program was funded. Within 10 days, 3 key scientists had withdrawn from the program citing family emergencies, though intelligence suggested they'd been offered deals, resign or face accidents. Within 2 weeks, a mysterious fire had destroyed the primary research facility in Natanz, the blaze so intense it had melted the centrifuges and destroyed years of research. Within 3 weeks, the Iranian program was in chaos, the timeline pushed back 5 years, maybe more, maybe forever, if the follow-up operations went as planned.
The analysts had counted the value. Hundreds of lives saved in a war that would now never happen. Cities that would remain standing. Children who would grow up. The mathematics were cold but conclusive. Eitan's death had purchased a future. The operation was considered a complete success, perhaps one of the most successful intelligence operations in the agency's history. The briefings climbed up the chain of command. The Prime Minister was informed. Commendations were written for files that would remain sealed. And Eitan's sacrifice was noted with the clinical language of efficiency. Field Commander remained in position to ensure team extraction despite critical injuries. Actions resulted in 0 friendly casualties and complete mission success. Recommend posthumous recognition at appropriate classification level. No mention of the alley. No mention of the blood pooling on Damascus stone. No mention of the choice he'd made in the final seconds of his life to save people who would never know his name. No mention of the radio call that had misdirected the Syrian response. No mention of the courage it took to tell your own team to leave you behind. No mention of how much it hurt to die alone in a foreign city for a country that could never acknowledge what you'd done. That was how it worked. That was the trade. Information for intelligence, intelligence for operations, operations for safety. And sometimes, when the equation demanded it, lives for time. That was how it worked. That was the code. Loyalty, duty, silence. Truth buried so deep it became myth. Rafi stayed at the grave after everyone else left, after the officers had saluted and departed, after Miriam had placed her hand briefly on his shoulder and walked away, after the cemetery workers had begun preparing to fill the grave. The sun was setting, painting the Jerusalem hills gold and crimson, the light catching on the limestone buildings that climbed the slopes like ancient teeth. He thought about Damascus, about the moment he'd heard Eitan's voice on the radio telling them to take the secondary exit, about how he'd known something was wrong, but had followed orders anyway, because that was what you did when your commander gave you a direct order in the middle of an operation. He thought about the 30 seconds it had taken his team to reach Al-Hamra Cafe, sprinting through Damascus streets with the engineer's laptop in a diplomatic bag, about how they'd piled into the van waiting there with a UN driver who'd asked no questions. He thought about the moment the van had pulled into traffic and he'd looked back, expecting to see Eitan climbing in after them, and had seen nothing but empty street and the orange glow of fire in the distance. He thought about the checkpoint they'd passed 2 kilometers later, how the guards had waved them through without a second glance because someone had called in a false report about suspects in the university district, how he'd realized what Eitan had done, what he was still doing even as he died. He thought about Eitan buying them that time with his blood, with his last breaths, with a courage that Rafi wasn't sure he possessed. "I'm sorry," Rafi said to the grave. The words felt inadequate, like trying to hold the ocean in a cup, like trying to explain to a dead man why you'd obeyed the order to leave him behind. "I'm sorry we left you. I'm sorry I didn't refuse. I'm sorry your mother will never know the truth." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of jasmine from somewhere beyond the cemetery walls, sweet and incongruous against the gravity of the moment. Rafi turned to leave, and that's when he saw the old woman standing at the cemetery gate. She was watching him.
Gray hair pulled back in a bun, eyes the color of storm clouds, a memorial candle in her hands even though the sun hadn't set yet. She didn't approach. She just stood there, looking at the fresh grave with the empty coffin and the folded flag, and Rafi understood who she was. He walked toward her, each step feeling heavier than the last. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge his approach until he was standing directly in front of her. "Mrs. Lev," he said. His voice cracked on the name. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry, but there was a weight in them that made Rafi's chest tighten, a depth of grief that looked bottomless. "You worked with my son." It wasn't a question. She said it with the certainty of someone who'd become an expert in reading the silences of military funerals, who learned to identify the colleagues and brothers-in-arms from the way they stood, the way they grieved. Rafi nodded anyway, unable to trust his voice. "They told me it was a training accident," she said. Her voice was steady, practiced, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation in her mind 1,000 times. "Parachute malfunction during a night jump. They said he died instantly, didn't suffer. They were very sincere about it, very apologetic, very thorough with their lies." She paused, her gaze never leaving his face. "But they're lying, aren't they?" Rafi said nothing. The code demanded silence. The oath demanded denial. He should tell her the official story, should reinforce the training accident narrative, should protect the mission even now, even at her son's funeral. That was the rule. That was the requirement. But standing there, looking at this woman who had already buried one man who died in service, and was now burying another, a woman who'd spent decades living with official lies and patriotic platitudes, the words felt like cowardice.
The words felt like one more betrayal in a chain of betrayals that had started in a Damascus alley and wouldn't end until the truth did. "I can't tell you what happened," Rafi said quietly. "I took an oath. There are things I can't say, places I can't name, operations I can't acknowledge. But something did happen. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the certainty of a mother who knows her son too well to believe comfortable lies. Yes. And my son died doing something that mattered." Rafi met her eyes. "He saved lives. More than I can ever tell you. More than he'll ever get credit for. What he did," Rafi's voice caught. "What he did in his last moments was the bravest thing I've ever seen." She nodded slowly, like she'd known the answer before she'd asked the question, like this conversation was just confirmation of what she'd suspected from the moment they'd come to her door with their flags and their lies. Then she looked past him, at the grave, at the empty coffin buried in the Jerusalem earth, at the gravestone that would say so much while revealing nothing. His father died in the Sinai, tank commander, October 1973. They sent me a letter with a medal and a story about heroism, about how he'd held a position against impossible odds, about how his sacrifice had saved his unit. I never knew if it was true. I never knew if it mattered." She paused, her gaze returning to Rafi. "I used to think I wanted the truth. I used to lie awake at night imagining what really happened in that desert, how he'd actually died, whether it was quick or slow, whether he'd been afraid. But now I'm old enough to know that truth is a luxury the living pay for with other people's blood." She shifted the memorial candle from one hand to the other, and Rafi noticed how steady her hands were, how practiced this grief had become. "You know what the hardest part is? Not the death. Not the absence. It's the silence. It's knowing that my husband did something that mattered, that my son did something that mattered, but never being able to talk about it, never being able to tell their story, never being able to say to anyone, this is what he did. This is why it was worth it. This is why I'm proud, even as my heart breaks." She looked back at Rafi, and he saw tears now, the first he'd seen from her, thin tracks on weathered cheeks. "But you know, don't you? You know what my son did. You were there." "Yes," Rafi whispered. "Then tell me one thing, just one. I won't ask for details or operations or secrets. I just need to know." She swallowed hard. "Did he choose this? At the end, did he have a choice? Or was it just bad luck and bullets?" Rafi thought about that Damascus alley, about Etan's voice on the radio ordering them to leave, about the choice that could have gone differently, about the rescue team that could have extracted him if he'd just given his location. He thought about the calculation Etan had made, the equation he'd solved with his own life as the variable. "He chose," Rafi said, his voice rough with emotion. "We were compromised. He was wounded. Command offered extraction, offered medical support, offered everything, and he refused.
He ordered us to leave. He bought us time. Rafi's words came faster now, breaking through the code, breaking through the oath, because this woman deserved to know, deserved to understand that her son hadn't died randomly, but purposefully. He could have lived, but saving himself would have risked the mission, risked us, risked everything he'd worked for. So he made a choice. He stayed. And because he stayed, we made it out. Because he stayed, the mission succeeded. Because he stayed, lives were saved that will never know they were in danger. And you obeyed his order, she said. You left him there. Yes, the word tasted like ash. Good.
She placed the memorial candle on the ground beside the gate, shielding the flame from the wind with her hand until it caught and burned steady. Then, don't waste it. Don't waste what he bought. Live well. Go home to whoever's waiting. Let his choice mean something more than grief and silence. She stood slowly, her knees protesting the movement, and looked at him with eyes that had buried too many men. My husband taught me something before he died. He said, the greatest honor you can give a fallen soldier isn't tears or monuments. It's living the life he died to protect. So live, young man. Live loudly. Live fully. Have children. Grow old. Complain about traffic and celebrate holidays, and forget sometimes how close we all came to losing everything. That's the gift. That's what makes the sacrifice worth it. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the twilight, and Rafi stood there watching until she was gone. Then he looked back at the grave one last time and made a promise he would keep for the rest of his life. He went home to Haifa that night. His wife was making dinner when he walked in, and she turned and saw something different in his face, something settled, like a storm had passed. He held her for a long time without saying anything, and she didn't ask why, because some silences are sacred. That night, after she fell asleep, Rafi sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter he would never send. It was addressed to Eitan, and it said the things that couldn't be said in the file, couldn't be said at the funeral, couldn't be said anywhere except in the private space between memory and grief. It said, I'm sorry I left you there. I'm sorry I followed orders. I'm sorry your mother will never know the truth. I'm sorry the world won't remember your name. It said, thank you for the life I still have. Thank you for my wife's smile.
Thank you for the children I'll have, the years I'll see, the ordinary days that will feel like miracles because I know how close they came to ending. It said, I will carry you. In the silence, in the shadows, in every mission where the code demands we trade names for duty. I will remember that someone paid. I will remember that freedom isn't free, that peace has a price, that the men and women who stand between the darkness and the dawn sometimes don't come home. And I will make it mean something. Rafi burned the letter in the kitchen sink and watched the words turn to ash. Then he went to bed and held his wife and dreamed of Damascus alleys and empty graves and stars that shone over both the living and the dead without judgment or mercy. The file on the Damascus operation was sealed. The engineer's laptop was destroyed after the data was extracted. The networks were rolled up. The program was delayed. And somewhere in the archives of an agency that doesn't officially exist, a name was added to a list of people who gave everything and received nothing but silence in return. Eitan Lev, field commander, died in service. The code doesn't explain. The code doesn't justify. The code just records what happened and locks it away where only shadows can read it. But on a Friday night in Haifa, a man comes home to his wife and lights the Shabbat candles and says a prayer for someone whose name he can't speak. And in Jerusalem, an old woman lights a memorial candle and whispers to the photograph of a son she'll never bury, a son who joined his father in the long list of men who disappeared into the desert, into the mountains, into the foreign cities where wars are fought in silence and paid for in blood that never makes the news. Years passed. Rafi rose through the ranks. He ran operations in Beirut, Cairo, Istanbul.
He recruited assets, managed networks, planned missions that would never be acknowledged. And every time he sent someone into the field, every time he looked at a map and calculated risk against reward, he thought about Damascus and the choice Eitan had made. He thought about loyalty that couldn't be bought or sold, only given. He thought about duty that didn't come with medals or monuments, only the quiet knowledge that you'd done what needed to be done. He thought about silence that protected the living by honoring the dead. And he taught these things to the men and women who came after him, the new recruits with fire in their eyes and certainty in their hearts. He taught them that the code wasn't about glory. It was about the moment when everything went wrong and you had to choose between saving yourself and saving the mission. It was about the split second when you looked at your team and decided their lives mattered more than your own. It was about becoming the kind of person who could make that choice and live with it or die with it, and either way sleep knowing you'd done right. Some of them understood, some of them didn't. Some of them would learn in Damascus alleys of their own, in moments of blood and fire when the radio crackled and the choice came and there was no time for anything except action. The code would hold them, or it wouldn't. That was the test. That was the price. That was the bargain every generation made with the one before it. We will carry the weight. We will keep the silence. We will stand in the shadows, so others can walk in the light. And when Rafi was old and gray and sitting in a Tel Aviv cafe watching his grandchildren play in the park, when the wars he'd fought had faded into history and the names he couldn't speak had turned to ghosts, he would sometimes think about that night in Damascus and wonder if Eitan had known.
Had he known in those final moments that his sacrifice would matter, that the mission would succeed, that the team would make it home? Or had he died with nothing but hope and duty and the terrible faith that sometimes you had to let go of everything to hold on to what mattered? Rafi never found the answer, but he lived his life as if Eitan had known, as if the choice had been made with full knowledge and zero regret, as if the last thing that went through Eitan's mind wasn't fear, but peace. Because that was the story worth believing. That was the truth that gave meaning to the silence. And in the end, that was all any of them had. The belief that the men and women who didn't come home had known exactly what they were doing, had chosen it freely, had bought the future with their blood, and counted it a fair trade. The memorial candle in Jerusalem burned every year. Eitan's mother grew old and died and was buried next to the empty coffin with her husband's name on one side and her son's on the other. The gravestone said nothing about Damascus or missions or choices made in alleys while the world burned. It just said, beloved, remembered, at peace. And on Friday nights, in houses across Israel, people lit candles and said prayers and went about their lives without ever knowing how close they'd come to losing everything. How many times the darkness had reached for them and been turned back by men and women whose names they would never know. That was the code. That was the silence. That was the price of freedom paid in currency that couldn't be counted or repaid, only honored in the private moments when memory spoke louder than words. Rafi kept his promise. He lived well. He went home. He let Eitan's choice mean something. And when his time came, when he was old and tired and ready to join the ghosts he'd carried all these years, his last thought was of Damascus, of the radio crackling in his ear, of Eitan's voice, steady and calm, giving the order to leave. He'd obeyed then. He would obey now. The code demanded it. The silence required it. The duty never ended, even in death. He closed his eyes and let go. And somewhere in the shadows where the honored dead gather, a field commander waited to welcome him home. The file stayed sealed. The names stayed buried. The truth stayed locked away. But the mission continued. It always did. That was the promise, the covenant, the sacred trust passed down through generations of men and women who understood that some wars are fought in darkness, some victories are never announced, and some heroes are mourned in silence because that's the only way to keep the world from knowing how close it came to falling. Loyalty, duty,
silence, truth. The code holds, the code endures, the code remembers when the world forgets. And in Damascus, in an alley that's been paved over and forgotten, the stones still carry the memory of blood spilled for people who never knew they were saved, by a man who refused evacuation until his team escaped, who bought time with his life, who chose the mission over himself, and made that choice without hesitation or regret. Loyalty, duty, silence, truth. The code holds, the code endures, the code remembers when the world forgets. And in Damascus, in an alley that's been paved over and forgotten, the stones still carry the memory of blood spilled for people who never knew they were saved, by a man who refused evacuation until his team escaped, who bought time with his life, who chose the mission over himself, and made that choice without hesitation or regret. Loyalty, duty, silence, truth. The code holds, the code endures, the code remembers when the world forgets.